thank you, Mindy, and thanks especially to the Los Angeles Poverty Department. I have to confess that until Mindy contacted me with an email inviting me to consider coming here, I'd never heard of the LAPD, this LAPD.
We're the good LAPD.
Now that I've done a bit of research into its history and all the initiatives that it maintains over the years, I have to say the world needs to know more about the work that you're doing here. So it's an honor to be here for the Los Angeles Poverty District Department with all of you. Thank you very much. Along with a few family members and friends and colleagues and students, our daughter Lizzie is here too. Mindy indicated that she's a social worker right down here in downtown LA. And I'm a literary biographer and a creative writer. I'm not a social historian. I presume to teach nobody anything about Skid Row. But in talking with Lizzie about her day-to-day work, I've gotten really profound insights into both the world of reality that John Fante inhabited in the early 1930s here, as well as into the life of his imagination. He wrote extensively about his years on the streets here and struggling alone. But sad to say, I'm learning something in talking with Lizzie about the challenges that we continue to face that in some respects aren't all that different from 80, 90 years ago almost now. So yeah, Lizzie's going to say a word or two eventually tonight. Mindy said maybe half hour, 45 minutes, so if I go long, please ring the bell or grab the hook. I don't want to bore you because what we have to look forward to is some really good food out there and Tommy Newman and his ensemble, jazz ensemble. So I want to stand in front of that. I'm kind of taking it a little bit easy on myself tonight by relying on selections of writings by John Fante, by Charles Bukowski, and I hope you'll indulge me in doing that. My friend Irek Dobrowolski is here all the way from Warsaw, Poland. He's put together a slideshow, PowerPoint, keynote kind of presentation, which will be on behind me. And if the images don't align perfectly with whatever we're talking about, bear with and roll with the flow, please. We haven't rehearsed this all that extensively. So, of course, John Fante is known as the LA writer, certainly one of the LA writers. And if I may ask for a show of hands, does everybody know anything about John Fante? Is John Fante a new factor for anybody here?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. The rest of you have heard of him anyway, maybe read something by him? No?
Yeah.
Well, for starters, he's known as the father of the Los Angeles novel, which is a fairly significant title to have earned. He's also been called the patron saint of LA writers. Certainly among writers, Fante is highly, highly esteemed for the accuracy and the authenticity with which he captures life in our city. I've long believed and sensed and known just from reading him very carefully that he does capture the spirit of a city that is unlike any other I've ever been in. And I hope to give you a flavor of that anyway this evening. But Los Angeles was not the only city he wrote about, and in fact, a couple of the selections I'm going to be reading from tonight deal, in addition to one from Dust to Dust, I'm going to be reading a selection from a later novel of his, Dreams from Bunker Hill. It takes place in Wilmington. I think it's the only novel that I know of that takes place in Wilmington. And then a story that he wrote late in his career that takes place in Paris, France. Mindy made copies here, and I'm going to read it out loud if you'll indulge me that too. It's not a long story at all, 5 minutes I should think. So if anybody wants a copy, when I get to that point, raise your hand and we'll make sure we get you a copy. Okay, so really thumbnail history of his early antecedents. John Fante is an Italian-American. He was born in Denver of immigrant parents, both from southern Italy. His father was a skilled bricklayer, stonemason, and somebody who knew how to build things. Unfortunately, he was also an alcoholic, pretty much lifelong, and so his family sort of lived with that burden. Among other things, meant John Fante grew up poor in Denver. And when he was about 18 years old, his father left the family. There were 4 children, and his wife, of course. He left the family for another woman, and John Fante was left sort of in the head of the household, but he had no skills to speak of. He dropped out of the University of Colorado and later would write, quote, "Poverty drove me out to California. I hitchhiked my way. I thought it might take me 2 weeks, but it was 2 months later when I got to Wilmington and a job in a fish cannery." So I want to shift the attention away from downtown LA just to begin here and put yourself in Wilmington. Have we all been to Wilmington?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
North Carolina.
Hmm?
Wilmington, North Carolina.
Different Wilmington. Wilmington is called the heart of the harbor. It's adjacent to the Los Angeles harbor. And then and now it was a seaport, sort of a raucous port town. And there, John Fante had a lot of jobs, a lot of menial, manual labor jobs, everything from digging ditches to unloading trucks in warehouses. And he learned what it was to work hard and sweat for $1. This, as I say, is the beginning of a chapter of a novel he published in 1977 called Brotherhood of the Grape, in which he remembers, or at least the main character of this novel, remembers arriving in Wilmington in about 1930. Wilmington was paranoid, a seaport town with big trucks hogging the streets, roaring through crowded intersections, full of honking klaxons and cursing drivers. I moved with the flow of people, aimlessly following a surge down Avalon Boulevard. I was tired, dirty, and dazed, tumbled like a cork along a street of oil derricks, factories, lumber yards, piles of girders and steel pipe, row upon row of trucks, pool halls, poker palaces, used car lots, even an amusement park with a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel. The laughter of women in bars flooded the streets. Hustlers leaned in doorways. Drunks sat on the curb. Smiling cops cruised in bemused attention. Where was I? Liverpool? Singapore? Marseille? Hunger. I smelled tomato sauce, the pizza coming from an Italian restaurant. He goes into the restaurant, or at least he knocks on the back door, begging to wash dishes for a meal, and the owner just throws him out unceremoniously, and he continues walking and starving, to tell you the truth. I walked out into the street, up Avalon Boulevard, but where and why? I found a bus bench. I rose and walked again, my feet aching. I met another bum like myself. He wore a long overcoat in that hot, late afternoon, the pockets stuffed with junk. "Hey," I said, "where can I get something to eat?" "There's lots of restaurants," he said. "Yeah, but I'm broke." "So am I." "So where do you eat?" "The Holy Ghost Mission." "Where is that?" "Follow me." The Holy Ghost Mission was on Banning Street between 2 pawn shops. A crowd of 30 men crowded the door. Some sat on the sidewalk, their backs against the storefront. At 7 o'clock, the door opened, and we were ushered in for a sermon about the mercy of God, the importance of faith, and the evils of drink. After the sermon, we were led behind a partition to the dining area, long tables, benches, and 2 ladies served us large bowls of beef stew, a hunk of bread, and an apple. Everything was free, and it happened every night at 7 o'clock. I sighed with relief. That night, I slept in a used car lot on Avalon, an old Cadillac with a velour back seat. But why had I been rejected? Was it my clothes? Was it my face? The dark stubble beard? The gauntness? The aspect of defeat? Did I repel people? Did I give off some mysterious antagonism, some anger at the world? A time came when I became afraid to approach bosses and employers. I walked the streets. I found the public library and read for hours, then dropped down back to the Holy Ghost Mission for supper. I thought of begging, for I had seen panhandlers scrounging coins, and it looked easy, but I lacked the courage. I was too ashamed. In 1933, John Fante wrote a letter to his mother. This is a copy of the original typescript letter that he wrote to his mother, who was living up in Northern California. And part of it goes this way. Dear Mother, after a week of consistent rain, the sun has come out here in the south, and today it is warm, and it looks as though most of the wet weather is gone for the season. I've been bumming around the very cheap and poverty-stricken sections of town, and in the police stations, where I am gathering material for an article I plan to write. I don't think he's telling the truth to his mother at this point. I know that he spent some time in police stations for other reasons, vagrancy among others, but he's writing to his beloved Italian mother up in Roseville, and he's saying, I'm planning to write an research about the situation. The police tell me that approximately 400 young fellows drift into Los Angeles every day, 100 of whom are arrested, booked for a night, and sent on their way. Even mothers with infants at their breasts come in. Yesterday, the police picked up a woman in the railroad yard who had 2 babies, one 3 months old and the other 2 years old. God help those people. So I think it's fair to say that John Fante knew poverty firsthand, what it was like to be hungry, what it was like to steal oranges, to just fill his stomach. And yet, even though he confesses to being ashamed and not to have the courage, in fact, he had the courage to write about these experiences. And he wrote about them often and throughout his life, off and on. He had many other subjects too. Stories about living on the streets, penniless, out of work, and he turned these experiences into tales that are now classics of American literature, to tell you the truth. Tales of his youth, of his struggles, of his despair, and of his desire to be something other than the poor kid from Colorado at the Holy Ghost Mission. He would infuse these stories, and this is, I would say, what John Fante is most esteemed for. He would infuse these stories, and I would say most of the writing throughout his career, with depths of emotion, unlike any of his contemporaries. Think of the lions of early 20th century American literature. Think of Ernest Hemingway, for example, who's great, no question about it. But read Ernest Hemingway and then read John Fante, and you're going to feel stuff in your gut as the characters feel them. It was this depth of emotion in his prose, in his fiction, that another writer would really respond to in a ferocious way, and that would be the young Charles Bukowski. Has anybody ever heard of Charles Bukowski? Okay, some of us, good. Charles Bukowski came about a generation after John Fante, and Bukowski is now universally regarded as the poet of the streets of LA, the poet laureate of the streets of LA. Bukowski himself lived a really rough life. From the time he was growing up with an abusive father, to early alcoholism, to almost hemorrhaging to death in county hospital here in LA, from abusing alcohol. And he was trying to make sense of a life pretty much out of control when, in our beautiful downtown library on 5th Street here, he was going through all the various sections of the library: geology, religion, history. And one day in the big fiction room, he pulled down a book at random, and it changed his life. Charles Bukowski would spend the rest of his career trying to make sure that John Fante would be remembered. Now, I need to pause here for a moment and say, in his life as a writer, he was obscure briefly, but he had some early success, John Fante did. By the time of the late 1930s, he was a nationally prominent writer, but he fell off the map by the 1950s or so. His works went out of print by and large, and he kind of backed into a second career as a Hollywood screenwriter. Bukowski wanted to do all he could to revive the literary career of John Fante. And so when Fante was about to die in close to 1980 or so, Bukowski persuaded his publisher, John Martin of Black Sparrow Press, to take a chance and republish Fante's 1939 novel, Ask the Dust. John Martin did. He republished the novel with Bukowski's really loving tribute to Fante, and I'd like to read that for you now too. It's just 2 pages long. So this is Charles Bukowski in the 1980 reprint of Ask the Dust, which at that point had been out of print for 40 long years. I was a young man, starving and drinking and trying to be a writer, says Bukowski. I did most of my reading at the downtown LA Public Library, and nothing that I read related to me or to the streets or to the people about me. It seemed as if everybody was playing word tricks, that those who said almost nothing at all were considered excellent writers. Their writing was an admixture of subtlety, craft, and form. It was read, and it was taught, and it was ingested, and it was passed on. It was a comfortable private, very slick and careful word culture. One had to go back to the pre-revolution writers of Russia to find any gamble, any passion. There were exceptions, but those exceptions were so few that reading them was quickly done, and you were left staring at rows and rows of exceedingly dull books, with centuries to look back on. With all their advantages, the moderns just weren't very good. I pulled book after book from the shelves. Why didn't anybody say something? Why didn't anybody scream out? I tried other rooms in the library. The section on religion was just a vast bog to me. I got into philosophy. I found a couple of bitter Germans who cheered me up for a while, and that was over. I tried mathematics, but upper math was just like religion. It ran right off me. What I needed seemed to be absent everywhere. I tried geology, found it curious, but finally non-sustaining. I found some books on surgery, and I liked those books on surgery. The words were new, and the illustrations were wonderful. I particularly liked and memorized the operation on the mesocolon. Then I dropped out of surgery, and I was back in the big room with the novelists and short story writers. When I had enough cheap wine to drink, I never went to the library. The library was a good place to be when you had nothing to drink or eat. The landlady was looking for you and for the best. In the library, at least, you had the use of the toilet facilities. I saw quite a number of other bums in there, most of them asleep on top of their books. I kept on walking around the big room, pulling the books off the shelves, reading a few lines, a few pages, then putting them back. Then, one day, I pulled a book down and opened it, and there it was. I stood for a moment reading. Then, like a man who had found gold in the city dump, I carried the book to a table. The lines rolled easily across the page. There was a flow. Each line had its own energy and was followed by another like it. The very substance of each line gave the page a form, a feeling of something carved into it. And here at last was a man who was not afraid of emotion. The humor and the pain were intermixed with a superb simplicity. The beginning of that book was a wild and enormous miracle to me. I had a library card. I checked the book out, took it to my room, climbed into my bed, and read it. And I knew long before I'd finished that here was a man who had evolved a distinct way of writing. The book was Ask the Dust, and the author was John Fante. He was to be a lifetime influence on my writing. I finished Ask the Dust and looked for other books of Fante's in the library. I found two, Dago Red and Wait Until Spring, Bandini's. They were of the same order, written of and from the gut and the heart. Yes, Fante had a mighty effect on me. Not long after reading these books, I began living with a woman. She was a worse drunk than I was, and we had some violent arguments. And often I would scream at her, "Don't call me a son of a bitch. I am Bandini, Arturo Bandini." Arturo Bandini is the main character in 4 novels of John Fante, including Ask the Dust. Fante, Bukowski goes on to say, was my God, and I knew that the gods should be left alone. One didn't bang at their door. Yet I liked to guess about where he had lived on Angel's Flight, and I imagined it possible that he still lived there. Almost every day I walked by, and I thought, is that the window Camilla Lopez crawled through? Camilla Lopez is the second character, main character in Ask the Dust. She and Arturo Bandini have a very, very fiery, passionate love affair. Is that the window Camilla crawled through? Is that the hotel door? Is that the lobby? I never knew. 39 years later, I reread Ask the Dust. That is to say, I reread it this year, that would be 1979, and it still stands, as do Fante's other works. But this one is my favorite because it was my first discovery of the magic. There are other books besides Dago Red and Wait Until Spring, Bandini. There are Full of Life and The Brotherhood of the Grape, and at the moment, Fante has a novel in progress, Dreams from Bunker Hill. Through other circumstances, I finally met the author this year. There is much more to the story of John Fante. It is a story of terrible luck and a terrible fate and of a rare and natural courage. Someday it will be told, but I feel that he doesn't want me to tell it here. But let me say that the way of his words and the way of his way are the same, strong and good and warm. That's enough. Now the book is yours. Signed Charles Bukowski, May 6, 1979. So, what is Ask the Dust about? It's about a young writer, Arturo Bandini, living on Bunker Hill back before redevelopment came along and shaved off the top of the hill and demolished all the glorious Victorian mansions and put up steel and glass and skyscrapers. Young Arturo Bandini, 20 years old or so, is living in a rooming house there. He has a typewriter, and he wants only to be a great writer. He wants to join the other books in the library, and he imagines his own book in the B section. He falls in love, or he meets, in the first place, a Mexican-American waitress at a buffet. Her name is Camilla Lopez. And though they're initially strongly attracted to each other, in no time at all, they are duking it out, largely in explicitly racist ethnic terms. He's calling her, forgive me, this is John Fante's writing, not me, he's calling her a dirty, filthy spick. She's calling him a dirty wop. These are fighting words back then. And the question is, why would John Fante write about these two young people, screaming such hateful language at each other? The reason, if you read the book, becomes quite clear. There are two marginalized young characters. He is Italian-American, and it may not be the case today, but in the early 20th century, Italian-Americans were considered very low on the social hierarchy. Certainly Mexican-Americans were at the time. And they are attempting, this is my reading, Arturo and Camilla are attempting to sort of project out of themselves their own insecurity by taking it out on each other. This is one small aspect of the novel, but an important one, I think. And they go through all sorts of turmoil, and they survive the Long Beach earthquake of 1933. And at the end, Camilla walks out into the Mojave Desert and disappears forever. And young Arturo Bandini has the rest of his life to look forward to. I want to ask Lizzie and a student of mine, Megan, if they want to pop in here just a little bit. I was saying earlier that John Fante writes this letter, I think telling a big fat fib to his mom that he's haunting the police stations looking for research materials. But he mentions a figure. He says 400 young fellows are drifting into town every day, 1/4 of whom, 100, are being jailed routinely. As I said, Lizzie works down here, and I think she might add something to the conversation. Lizzie.
Sure. First of all, so my name is Lizzie, and I'm a social worker at the Immigration Center for Women and Children, which is right here in downtown LA. And I work with an immigrant population, and these people came to the United States to find a better life for themselves. So a lot are seeking asylum here, so many of them are persecuted for mental illness or for homosexuality. A lot of them live in areas with gang warfare and violence, so they come to the United States to get away from that and to have a good life. Similarly, people come for economic reasons, so they live in poverty in their home countries and they come here to pursue better lives and jobs. And with that though, all of my clients talk about the daily fear that they live in, that they're going to get picked up by police or that they're going to run into an immigration officer, and ultimately they fear they're going to get deported to their home countries. A lot of our clients, unfortunately, are picked up for so many different reasons. A lot of the times it's just because law enforcement finds out they're here illegally, so they get picked up and they're sent to these detention facilities in the middle of the San Bernardino desert. Part of my job is going out to this detention facility in Adelanto, California, which is barren. It's in the middle of nowhere, and just so you know, immigration detention is considered civil detention. It's not criminal, but you would never know that based on this facility. It's punitive, and the guys are wearing jumpsuits. And so my visits out there have really helped me to see what these people are up against, and it's pretty dire. So our attorneys at the law firm where I work fight to get our clients out of detention. They get them out on bond, or they get them certain visas or asylum. And so once the clients are out, it's kind of my role to step in and help them reintegrate into society. Once they're back in LA, some of them have family members who they can live with, and those people are so fortunate. If that's not the case though, most of them end up either homeless or they fall through the cracks and I never see them again. But a lot of my clients do end up on Skid Row. I'm sometimes able to connect them to housing through the Department of Mental Health, which is always a small victory for me. But people I work with have a very strong community in Skid Row, and I've seen it firsthand. And I have a client, one of my favorite success stories is my client who was released in December of last year from detention, and I was able to connect him to housing at a Skid Row SRO, single room occupancy on San Julian Street right here in Skid Row. And he's thriving, and I see him as I walk around Skid Row, as I work in downtown, and I see him, I run into him. He's connected to mental health, he's connected to a psychiatrist, so he's able to get his medication. He goes to community events in Skid Row, he goes to art classes, he goes to singing classes, so he's thriving, and it's a thrill for me to see that. And I would say one of my favorite days with this particular client was last year around Christmas. He visited me in my office here on Spring Street, and he wanted to thank me and the attorneys for working on his behalf. And he sang me put on a one-man Christmas Carol show for me. And it was just the sweetest thing I've ever seen. So that's an example of a really amazing success when it does happen. But rereading Ask the Dust, I read it when I was a kid in high school through pretty young eyes, and then I reread it just this last week for this event. And reading it now from the perspective I have working in downtown and with people who live on Skid Row and seeing what goes on down there, it's amazing that the world that Arturo Bandini inhabited 75 years ago is still the exact same from what I gather. So thank you for having me in.
So as I was saying, for somebody who doesn't know any of this stuff myself, it's wonderful to have somebody in the family who can help me understand a novel and the world I live in still today. Now, Megan Mailer is an honor student at Long Beach State where I teach, and she's writing an honors thesis on part of the novel, Ask the Dust. In particular, she's writing about Arturo's lover, girlfriend, antagonist, Pasionara, Camila Lopez. And she's turned up some fascinating historical background, which really opens up the novel for me to understand why Camilla acts as she does. Camilla, she's a waitress in a buffet, and she seems increasingly nervous through the entire novel. In fact, she ends up having a nervous breakdown. And it came to our attention that, in fact, she may have had some powerful external forces contributing to this. Megan, talk a little bit about the Repatriation program.
Yeah. During the 1930s and the 40s, during the Great Depression, there was this thing called Mexican repatriation, which was essentially deportation back to the Mexican border, where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I believe, of Mexican and Mexican Americans were deported from Los Angeles and Texas and other states near the border. And there wasn't often a distinction between if you were Mexican American, if you were Mexican. It was often just if you have any, Mexican heritage, you were considered Mexican, and there was this need to get rid of them. A lot of times because there wasn't as much labor, job availability, so they were seen as kind of the first to go. So I'm kind of reading Ask the Dust within that context and trying to see why she possibly is, becoming increasingly anxious. And at one point, I think it was on her driver's license, she changes her name to Camilla Lombard instead of Lopez. So thinking of those reasons that why she may be kind of changing her identity, or at the end when she, drifts off into the desert, what are these social forces that could be pushing her to do these things? So it is really important to think of it within that context too.
Terrific, thank you. Very good. Just so that you don't leave tonight thinking that reading John Fante is like a total downer, he's also one of the funniest writers I know of, and I mean laugh out loud funny. His stuff is so full of life and verve and energy and youthful everything that I want to close by reading the beginning of Ask the Dust, which I hope gives you a little bit of a sense of that. And then I'll be really super happy if anybody has any questions or comments, okay? So this is chapter 1 of Ask the Dust, published in 1939, although the events of the novel take place in 1933. So we're in 1933. One night, I was sitting on the bed in my hotel room on Bunker Hill, down in the very middle of Los Angeles. It was an important night in my life because I had to make a decision about the hotel. Either I paid up and got out, that was what the note said, the note the landlady had put under the door. A great problem, deserving acute attention. I solved it by turning out the lights and going to bed. In the morning, I woke. I decided that I should do more physical exercise and began at once. I did several bending exercises. Then I washed my teeth, tasted blood, and remembered the advertisements, deciding that it was time to go out and get some coffee. I went to the restaurant where I always went to the restaurant, and I sat down on the stool before the long counter, and I ordered coffee. It tasted pretty much like coffee, but it wasn't worth the nickel. Sitting there, I smoked a couple of cigarettes, read the box scores of the American League games, scrupulously avoided the box scores of National League games, and noted with satisfaction that Joe DiMaggio was still a credit to the Italian people because he was leading the league in hitting. A great hitter, that DiMaggio. I walked out of the restaurant, stood before an imaginary pitcher, and swatted a home run over the fence. Then I walked down the street toward Angel's Flight, wondering what I would do that day. But there was nothing to do, so I decided to walk around. I walked down Olive Street, past a dirty yellow apartment house that was still wet like a blotter from last night's fog. And I thought of my friends, Effie and Carl, who were from Detroit and had lived there. And I remembered the night Carl hit Effie because she was pregnant, was going to have a baby, and he didn't want to have a baby. But they had the baby, and that's all there was to that. And I remembered the inside of that apartment, how it smelled of mice and dust, and the old women who sat in the lobby on hot afternoons, and the old woman with the pretty legs. Then there was the elevator man, a broken man from Milwaukee, who seemed to sneer every time you called your floor, as though you were such a fool for choosing that particular floor. The elevator man, who always had a tray of sandwiches on the elevator and a pulp magazine. Then I went down the hill on Olive Street, past the horrible frame houses reeking with murder stories, and on down Olive to the Philharmonic Auditorium. And I remembered how I'd gone there with Helen to listen to the Don Cossack choral group, and how I got bored, and we had a fight because of it. And I remembered what Helen wore that day, a white dress, and how it made me sing at the loins when I touched it. Oh, that Helen, but not here. And so I was down on 5th and Olive, where the big streetcars chewed your ears with their noise, and the smell of gasoline made the sight of the palm trees seem sad, and the black pavement still wet from the fog of the night before. So now I was in front of the Biltmore Hotel, walking along the line of yellow cabs with all the cab drivers asleep except the driver near the main door. And I wondered about these fellows and their fund of information, and I remembered the time Ross and I got an address from one of them, how he leered salaciously and then took us to Temple Street of all places. And whom did we see but two very unattractive ones, and Ross went all the way. But I sat in the parlor and played the phonograph and was scared and lonely. I was passing the doormat of the Biltmore, and I hated him at once with his yellow braids and 6 feet of height. John Fante was 5'3" in elevator shoes. 6 feet of height and all that dignity, and now a black automobile drove to the curb, and a man got out. He looked rich. And then a woman got out, and she was beautiful. Her fur was silver fox, and she was a song across the sidewalk and inside the swinging doors. And I thought, oh boy, for a little of that, just a little of that. And she was a dream as I walked along, her perfume still in the wet morning air. Then a great deal of time passed as I stood in front of a pipe shop and looked, and the whole world faded except that window, and I stood and smoked them all and saw myself a great author with that natty Italian briar and a cane, stepping out of a big black car. And she was there too, proud as hell of me, the lady in the silver fox fur. We registered, and then we had cocktails, and then we danced a while, and then we had another cocktail, and I recited some lines from Sanskrit, and the world was wonderful, because every 2 minutes some gorgeous one gazed at me, the great author, and nothing would do, but I had to autograph her menu, and the silver fox girl was very jealous. Los Angeles, give me some of you. Los Angeles, come to me the way I came to you. My feet over your streets, you pretty town. I loved you so much, you sad flower in the sand, you pretty town. A day and another day and the day before, and the library again with the big boys up on those shelves, old Dreiser, old Mencken, all the boys down there, and I went to see them. Hiya, Dreiser, hiya, Mencken, hiya, hiya. there's a place for me too, and it begins with a B. In the B shelf, Arturo Bandini. Make way for Arturo Bandini. His slot for his book, and I sat at the table and just looked at the place where my book would be, right there, close to Arnold Bennett. Not too much that Arnold Bennett, but I'd be there to sort of bolster up the B's. Old Arturo Bandini, one of the boys, until some girl would come along, some scent of perfume through the fiction room, some click of high heels to break up the monotony of my fame. Gala day, gala dream. That's the first half of the first chapter. I've talked about Fante and his work in lectures here over the years, back east and in Europe. And I always have, and in my classes at the university, I feel it's my obligation to let young people know that there's a great author who is of their own city. And I have a money-back guarantee that I offer any and all comers. So you're now among them. My offer is this. Buy a copy of Ask the Dust, and I have no financial stake in this. I'm not going to get a penny in royalties. Buy a copy of Ask the Dust, save the receipt, and then read it. And if you don't agree with me that Ask the Dust is an American masterpiece, write email to me in which you explain your reasons why this isn't an American masterpiece, and I will include your receipt, and I will cheerfully refund your purchase price. I kid you not, I've made this offer for the last 30 years, maybe 20 years plus, and never once has anybody ever taken me up on it. So I'm pretty confident in making the same offer. I think you'll really learn something about our city here. You'll be moved by the adventures and misadventures of Arturo Bandini, and you'll be introduced to a great American writer. Thank you very much. Okay, any questions? Yes.
Or comments.
Comment.
Yeah, or a combination. Okay, so I'm from Arizona, and I'm from a border community in Arizona, and I was also a TANF welfare case manager while there. One thing that I know is that the Catholic Church works very, very closely with immigrating Hispanics into the community. They work very intricately, like with legal aid and so forth, connecting people with all other entities. And so I was just curious to know, one, have you used them as a resource? Also, here in Skid Row, I'm co-chair of the Downtown Women's Action Coalition. I am a Skid Row resident. I know that Union Rescue Mission, Downtown Women's Center, Union Rescue, Downtown Women's Center, there's another one. I'm sorry? Midnight Mission. I've had friends who are illegal immigrants who have stayed at these places, so I know. I was also at a women's safe house prior to coming down here, and I had some friends who were staying there who are also illegal immigrants. So, and I know that these entities also help people with getting their citizenship. It's a long pathway, but I know that there is connection to housing as well as citizenship, working in combination with them. And also, I'm a writer and woman feminist activist in Skid Row, so I would love to maybe meet with you sometime and hear their stories, and tell their stories, just subjectively and, without using their names and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, actually. I work with a writers group of downtown writers, and I'm pretty well read. We do workshops and stuff like that, but I have never really heard of Fante, and it seems, I don't know whether, you think it might be a regional thing? I mean, I know European writers, I've heard of, a great many, but Fante has somehow escaped me. I'm embarrassed, actually, because I've never read his work.
Excuse me, but you're in excellent company, because for some reason most of the world still doesn't know of Fante. I shouldn't say most of the world. In Europe, in Italy, in France, in Germany, in England, John Fante is regarded on the same level with all the canonical, American authors. Here in our own country, for some strange reason, he remains kind of a cult figure. I wouldn't say it's an acquired taste, because as soon as people read him, they go, wow, where was he all this time? So no reason to feel embarrassed.
Yeah, we know Bukowski. That's one of our heroes, because he used to live in the King Edwards, they say, right downtown here on Skid Row. But he has escaped me, and some of the things that you were talking about, it reminds me of Steinbeck, of what he was talking about in The Port City.
Yeah, actually, one of Fante's great unrealized dreams was to write a novel that would challenge John Steinbeck's supremacy in his novel *The Grapes of Wrath*, about American, mostly Okie,
Cannery Row, that would sound similar
migrant
to that.
workers. And Fante wanted to write a counterpart novel about Filipino farm workers. He wrote about a third of it or so, and his life went in a different direction. So that was a very important subject to him.
How did you get
The
on?
other question was, is there any notable screenplays that he wrote?
I mentioned that he had a long career in Hollywood, and he wrote mostly what used to be called the B-card film, the undercard movie on the double feature. But he did write one one film based on a novel that he had published called *Full of Life*. It was a big smash hit as a novel. As a film, it was nominated for Best Picture of the Year by the Writers Guild. And you can still find this film, *Full of Life*, and enjoy it. It's a very solidly put together movie.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet.
How did you get on the Fante bandwagon?
When I was 24, a long time
About 5
ago,
years.
in 1974, I bought a used book. I bought a used book in a secondhand store that no longer exists. And after it was by this guy John Fante, I didn't know a thing about it. And after page one, I thought, I had studied English literature, American literature at UCLA, and my teachers had mentioned him. So in 1974, Ask the Dust had been out of print since 1939. And I kept thinking, wow, how come the world doesn't know about John Fante? I can't wait to read his biography. And I for some naive reason, I thought somebody was going to write a biography of this guy that nobody knew about. 20 years later, I was still waiting, so I heard myself telling a colleague at the Long Beach State one day, I'm going to write the biography of John Fante, and then I got really scared. I'd never done anything like that, but I sort of felt like I had to follow through. And I identified so closely with the figure of Arturo Bandini, a young writer in LA trying to make it and failing and romantic problems. So, that's yes.
Yeah, I wanted to know how old he was when he wrote the novel, and then also did he write his entire life, and how and where did he die?
Yeah, all good questions. He wrote the novel in 1938, late 1938. It was published in November 1939. He had been born in 1909, so he was 29 when he started writing the novel and 30 when it came out. He wrote his whole life, tons and tons and tons of manuscripts, many unpublished still. He published in his lifetime 12 either novels or story collections, which is it's a good career. He wrote dozens and dozens of films and television episodes for 1950s American TV. It took me a long, long time to persuade his widow, and then when she died, his surviving children, to understand that his papers needed to be someplace safe. And finally, after years of trying to get them to see this, they saw it. And so now UCLA Special Collections. The John Fante papers are safely archived, and they amount to some 50 linear feet of material. So 50 linear feet, this is maybe 1/8 of an inch.
Oh, wow,
50
that way.
feet of manuscripts, correspondence, screenplays. It's really impressive. And I would point you to, if you're at all interested in that, Google John Fante, A Life in the Works, and you'll get to a really splendid website that allows you to see selections from the papers. So you can see manuscript pages and letters that he wrote and photographs and so on. John Fante, A Life in the Works at UCLA Library.
And how did he pass away?
Sadly to say, he inherited his father's alcoholism. He was a lifelong drunk and never really kept care of himself. He contracted diabetes and kept drinking, and by the end he lost in increments both legs after multiple surgeries, lost his eyesight, and he was raving mad for sort of intermittent intervals. But one of the miraculous stories of his life is near the end of his life in 1981, I think. He died in 83. In 81, he cleared up and he asked his wife to go get a tablet, and he dictated to her an entire novel, which became Dreams from Bunker Hill. And that too is a novel that takes up Arturo Bandini as a young man in LA. I always tell my students, close your eyes and try to write one paragraph. And then imagine being blind and writing a whole novel. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about how John Fante fell off the grid when he was posed to become the next John Steinbeck, or even better?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So John Fante is about to publish Ask the Dust in 1939. He's already published 2 books, and they've been quite well received, and his editor and publishers in New York think that he is poised to sort of break through. And in fact, he's being groomed to be the next John Steinbeck. His novel Ask the Dust was published by an obscure firm in Mechanicsville, Pennsylvania, called Stackpole and Sons Publishers. Stackpole and Sons Publishers specialized in woodcraft and camping lore books, books of self-help, and oddly enough, political books. And the same year that Stackpole Sons published Ask the Dust, 1939, they also published an unexpurgated version of Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, because they wanted the world to see what his plans really were all about. Hitler had published already an expurgated, approved version of Mein Kampf through Houghton Mifflin Publishers, I believe. And the translator of that then Alan Cranston, later Senator Alan Cranston. So when Stackpole Sons published an unexpurgated version of Mein Kampf, Hitler's agents in the U.S. got wind of this, and they sued Stackpole Sons, took him to court for defamation of character and copyright infringement, and they threw the book at this little tiny Pennsylvania publisher who almost went bankrupt trying to fight this battle. And whatever attention, much less funding, might have gone to promoting John Fante's career just went up in smoke trying to get out from under the Hitler thing. So, strange story.
It's bizarre.
Okay, well,
Thank
maybe
you
on
so
that
much.
note.